You know, after being disappointed again and again and again recently about no Bloodborne news, I set off to find some potential answers as to why this game won't be updated, ported, remade, touched, or wanted by anybody at Sony. So I went straight to the top. I asked Sony why they won't do anything with Bloodborne. They haven't gotten back to me. So I did the next best thing. I asked Japan Studio if they're doing anything with Bloodborne, but apparently they're on vacation or something. So before we get into the meat of the video, I did want to bring up the PC port discussion and why there isn't any for Bloodborne. I mean, Sony already ported so many other games to PC, so I got thinking, what are the size of those teams porting these kinds of games? You know, if it's too big a size, maybe they don't see the value in Bloodborne going to PC, although I don't think any fan really agrees with that statement. So I did what any concerned fan would do, and I googled about the Horizon PC port and the God of War 2018 PC port. Now, the Horizon PC port was handled by some place called Nixxes Software. Now, they weren't the original developers to port it over, but the original ones screwed it up and weren't doing well or something. So I chose to look at Nixxes Software since they largely handled the rest of the PC port. So at the company, there are about 55 employees. Now, it's important to remember that there may be other business employees as well in HR, maybe a receptionist, etc. But switching ports for a second, Jetpack Interactive also largely did the PC port of God of War 2018. I also didn't realize this, but on their page, they state they actually had a hand in upgrading the Steam version of Dark Souls back in the day, which is cool, but doesn't really go into it more than that. So to get a better idea of their size, I reached out to see how big they were, since it's not readily accessible on what we call the internet. So a few days went by, I checked my email, and lo and behold, they didn't respond. But after some digging, there are allegedly about 25 employees, so again, they may have other employees other than the development team there. I'm not sure, but whatever, it's a small company. Anyway, regardless, at this point it's obvious it doesn't take a huge team to port a game to PC. Yet still it hasn't happened with Bloodborne. So we get back to the question, why is there no update at all on Bloodborne? Well, let's start off positively and go through one reason why, and it's the obvious reason, and that's that Bluepoint is working on a remake of some sort. Back in 2020, it was a huge deal when everyone found out that Bluepoint was working on a remake of Demon's Souls. So after that game released, fans naturally theorized that the next remake out of that development team would be Bloodborne. The evidence at least points that way. Bluepoint came out after Demon's Souls released and announced that they're working on some other original game. They did not specifically say an original IP, but instead just an original game. Since this is a studio that essentially only remasters or remakes previous games, an original game could easily mean a sequel, prequel, or anything else to an existing IP. However, an industry insider back in 2021 came out saying that the original game that they're working on will be similar in size to Spider-Man Miles Morales. She also claimed that the devs are working on a remake of a beloved game. Though this could mean a few potential games, the most likely would be Bloodborne. Why? Well, because there's absolutely Demon's Souls DNA that runs through every Souls game. Even though Bloodborne plays differently, the DNA is still there. There are also assets in the game that can be reused pretty straightforwardly, so going straight from Demon's Souls to Bloodborne would be easy enough and would make sense. Additionally, there is another insider who recently said that Bloodborne Remake is in development, and he was correct in many of his predictions regarding Sony's recent showcase. So take it with a grain of salt, but there is another insider right now saying that. So whatever game that Bluepoint's actually working on, they've been working on it since around 2020, so you would think we'd at least hear some sort of update on it by now. However, doing some research, I quickly realized that Bluepoint won't announce or show their game until it's very close to releasing. I based this off of their Demon's Souls remake announcement. The trailer was announced in June 2020, the gameplay trailer in September 2020, and finally releasing it in November of that year. All in all, that's less than 6 months from announcement to release. With all this evidence, there's plenty to go around and give us false hope and break our hearts yet again when it turns out that Bloodborne Remake isn't even happening. And along those same lines, let's now look at, unfortunately, the more likely reasons why there's no info or update on Bloodborne at all. Number 1. The code prevents an easy port or update. There are rumors that the code of the game is ridiculously complex and that only From Software can update the game in some way. This would explain a lot, since Sony would need to spend a bunch of extra money to hire some sort of dedicated team to figure out the code alone. This would stop a cheap and quick PC port from happening, so financially it kinda makes sense. However, I don't think this is true at all. Not the code being complex, because it might, but the part that only From Software can work on it. I have a few reasons to think this way. First, it's reported that one person actually went into the code and said it actually isn't all that complex. Second, if Bluepoint is remaking the game from the ground up, accessing the code may not be the most important thing in the world. Not to say it wouldn't be helpful. In this article here regarding Demon's Souls Remake, Bluepoint's chief technology officer, Peter Dalton, said that they took gameplay pieces of the original code and plugged it into their engine that they were using. So, at the end of the day, it is helpful, but may not be a necessity if they actually want to remake a game or not. And before moving on, there's one more reason I don't buy this code excuse. There's a game out there called Final Fantasy VIII. And this game in particular has never been remastered or touched because the game's code had literally been lost. Yet, in 2019, they announced and released Final Fantasy VIII Remastered. See, when companies or devs want to, they can work around complex or even missing code. Now, given that the first theory wasn't that compelling to me, let's move on to a second one, and I find this much more interesting. And that is that Sony's IP license with Bloodborne isn't quite what it seems. It is well known that Sony owns the IP for Bloodborne, but not everything always adds up. If you own a successful IP, you would want to mention it more, at least more than Sony does at the moment. It's called, I don't know, marketing and being smart, obviously, come on guys. Anyway, Sony owns the IP, but what does that actually mean? There are 4 types of intellectual property rights: copyright, patent, trademark, and trade secrets. Right away, let's get rid of patents and trade secrets. They aren't applicable here, trust me. Trademarks are often used for logos and brand names, often used to further protect the business's reputation or brand reputation. Copyrights, on the other hand, apply to creative expressions and other products. So there is actually a difference here. Looking at UC Berkeley, copyrights protect creative works by ensuring that only creators have the rights to reproduce, distribute, display, perform, and alter these works. Creative works including writing, drawing, artistic works, computer code, and computer software, among other things. Now, there is this difference, but don't get confused. You can either copyright something or trademark it. You can't do both. Most of the time, games are trademarked. There are other protections, obviously. It's not like you can take Nathan Drake one-to-one and put him in your game. You'd get sued and lose pretty quickly. But anyway, here Sony has a registered trademark for Bloodborne. But an interesting theory is that something is off about it. Perhaps there are certain confidential terms that we just can't know about, and those confidential terms say that Sony can't actually do anything with Bloodborne without FromSoft's permission. It stands to reason that FromSoft may have some sort of creative rights in this game, just not a trademark. So it's possible that something like this behind the scenes had occurred. It may also make sense as to why Sony never talks about Bloodborne, aka maybe there's bad blood between the companies, or Sony knows it can't do anything with the property, so why talk about it? It's definitely a far-fetched theory, and usually I would say it's unlikely, but given the completely odd behavior of Sony towards Bloodborne, there could be some inkling of truth here. Also, as an aside, Japanese law may come into play since both companies are Japanese, but that's not something I'm going to research right now. So let's move on to theory number 3, and that's that Sony doesn't see any value in Bloodborne. This theory is actually the most bonkers of all of them, so I won't dwell on this too long. Now, obviously a game company wants their games to sell well and be worth the investment. Dead Space Remake sold a lot, but wasn't as successful as EA wanted. But then again, EA wouldn't be happy with $1 trillion a quarter, so whatever. Anyway, Sony may not see the value of remaking Bloodborne. There was an emotional connection between Sony and Demon's Souls, so maybe that had a larger part in remaking the game. However, this theory quickly falls apart. Bloodborne was considered largely successful by Sony when it came out, as it's said in many articles. As a baseline, that would likely mean it would sell more than 2 million copies now. Sony also knows that fans want anything to do with this game. And lastly, Demon's Souls Remake sold 1.4 million copies as of September 2021, less than 1 year after its release. That Sony announced that means that they are proud of those numbers. But what's even weirder is that it's now on the PS Plus collection, so I guarantee a lot more have played that game. Also take into account it launched on the brand new PS5 with a small install base, so the sales numbers make sense in that regard. Regardless, Sony being happy with those sales means inherently that it was financially successful. So then this begs the question, if Sony was happy with Demon's Souls remake sales numbers, then why would Bloodborne not be remade under similar conditions and budget? Demon's Souls and Bloodborne aren't exactly different in game length and areas that need to be created. I mean, sure, Bloodborne is bigger, but it also sold a heck of a lot more than the OG Demon's Souls. The original Demon's Souls game sold a little over 1 million copies, so here it's a little more for the remake. But for a large, beautiful AAA game being financially successful based off just 1.4 million copies, it means whatever Bluepoint's budget is low. Much lower than any other big AAA game nowadays, at least. Regardless, the value is there, so this theory doesn't make sense at all. So let's move on. Theory number 4 being the most likely, Sony hates Bloodborne and its fans. Now moving on to theory number 5 and the last theory of this video, that there is some agreement between Sony and From Software.
Oh, I know very well how the secrets beckon so sweetly.
In this theory, it would be that there is some agreement between the two companies and that Bloodborne is tied to From Software in some way. Hypothetically, Sony and From Software could have agreed that Sony would have the rights to Bloodborne, but only From Software could ever do something with the game or give permission for someone else to work on it. This particular example doesn't make sense, but a better example might be that when a contract is signed, there may have been a spoken term regarding the game that isn't actually in the written contract. Perhaps From Software didn't want Sony to do anything with the game, and Sony, out of respect, promised From Software that they would not, or something like that. Japanese culture is different, so it's not out of the realm of possibility. Ultimately, no matter what theory you subscribe to, none of them truly make sense as to why Sony doesn't outright tell us that they aren't doing anything with Bloodborne. It's not like Sony says we have no plans to do anything with this. The insanity is that they don't respond or post about the game ever. That's why the community and apparently every article writer ever is confused. People inside and outside the industry are also confused and want this game to be remade or updated in some way. It's a maddening situation because there's no rationale as to why nothing, not even a port, is happening. Before I get to the end of the video, I want to do 2 more things. First off, I want to apologize that I don't actually have an answer to this Bloodborne situation. But also number 2, I would like to guesstimate just how big Bloodborne truly is as a game. So let's get to it. With some information that I've researched, I'd like to propose to you why I think Bloodborne is far more successful than what Sony leads us to believe. Don't let the sales numbers fool you, it did sell 2 million copies, and I'll put a huge asterisk here, and I'll get back to this. The game allegedly had a budget of 20 million, so that 2 million in sales automatically means it was a huge success. Of course, at first glance, after some Google searching, it appears Bloodborne had sold well below its counterparts. Sekiro had sold 5 million copies after over a year, and Dark Souls 3 took over 4 years to sell 10 million copies. Even Dark Souls 2 had almost 2.5 million copies after about a year on the market, a game that came out before Bloodborne. But let's put everything into perspective. All those other games were multi-platform, and it showed in sales. It's actually a testament to Bloodborne that it likely outsold or came close to Dark Souls 2 sales in the same time frame, given that Bloodborne is an exclusive. But let's also check back into that asterisk I left earlier. The last official update on sales numbers for Bloodborne was at the end of 2015, with it selling over 2 million copies. Sure, there's some unofficial data or suspicious data you can find, but that was the last official update. Unlike Dark Souls 3 after 4 years, we never got an update again. So what does all this mean and why am I saying it? Well, essentially I want to make the case that the install base is actually much closer to Dark Souls 3. My reasoning for this includes many things, but to start out, this game was also apparently free for a long time when getting PS4s, and it likely helped move a lot of PS4 units, as well as copies of the game. This is also one of the best reviewed PlayStation exclusive games, period, so PlayStation owners will know about this game. People like me bought and played this game later on as well, not at launch. Word of mouth is a real thing, and it also contributed to Demon's Souls' success. So this is definitely a game that continues to sell or be installed over time. Personally, I think the sales for this game actually lie somewhere between 4 to 5 million copies. But then you add in everyone who played for free, and the total install base is potentially closer to what I would estimate 7 to 8 million. Again, I'm making a lot of assumptions, but I have more evidence for thinking this way. Let's look at a different type of metric. Let's look at VaatiVidya, the only channel you'll ever need to watch for any Souls lore that you want. I want to do a comparison between Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, because both came out within a year of each other. Dark Souls 3 lore, a video of his, has just over 3 million views, with the main boss lore video having 11 million views. Very substantial, but for a game that sold 10 million copies, it makes sense. However, with Bloodborne's individual character lore videos, they gain approximately the same amount of views as Dark Souls 3, about 2 to 3 million per video. But even more bizarre, Bloodborne's lore video has currently over 11 million views. Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 are substantially similar in these sorts of metrics, and yet Bloodborne has apparently sold 2 or even 3 million copies versus Dark Souls 3 with over 10 million copies. That doesn't usually happen. I was also thinking of not bringing this up at all, but I also did a comparison of the soundtracks between the two games and how many views it has on YouTube. Again, I understand it's not great evidence, but for God's sake, look at the DLC track views alone. They're staggering. Lady Maria at 7 million, Ludwig at 13 million, and Lawrence at about 5 million. This also isn't taking into account the songs that are published on other YouTube accounts, with millions more in additional views. A second Ludwig video has over 9.5 million. Even the final boss of the main game, Garmin. Well, anyway, it's got over 12 million views. By comparison, Dark Souls 3 struggles on any music track to reach 2 million or topple that 2 million mark. Maybe every Bloodborne track is just a banger, but it indicates a lot more people are listening and involved in the Bloodborne fanbase. Now again, this isn't to say this evidence is great. I know it isn't. But what I'm trying to just do is argue that the Bloodborne community is substantial and that it's a lot more successful. Now again, you can judge success in a lot of ways, but here it was financially successful, and I believe the install base has to be closer to Dark Souls 3. Because again, Dark Souls 2 at 2.5 million versus Dark Souls 3 at 10 million copies doesn't just happen. Bloodborne, in one way or another, had to have filled in that gap in some way. But everything Sony does or does not do would make a regular person believe that this game was just a moderate or decent success, something to leave in the past. I don't believe that's the case at all. I believe this game is ridiculously successful and has a huge install base. So where does this all leave us? Well, unfortunately, in the exact same spot we've been in for years now. We're no closer in the year 2023 to figuring out what's going on versus the year 2017. It's unfortunate, and quite frankly, it sucks. But like every Bloodborne fan, I am hopeful. I am hopeful that Bluepoint is working on something, because that would make the most sense. Unfortunately, we still have a long time to wait until Bluepoint likely announces their next game, which may or may not be this. So in the meantime, I'll keep playing Bloodborne at its usual 1080p, 30 FPS kind of state that it's in. Thank you to any and all who are watching this. I hope you all have a pleasant day.